In the small English town of Whitstable, where narrow streets wound along the coast like threads of old lace, and the salty sea breeze carried scents of iodine and damp earth, lived young Frances Winters. She was 19 years old, and her life flowed steadily, like the ebb and flow of the waves she saw from the window of her modest home. The house stood on the outskirts, in a neighborhood of simple folk, fishermen, seamstresses, and small traders. Frances was the daughter of a widow, Mrs. Winters, a woman with weary eyes and deft hands who ran a small boarding house for ladies and earned a living by sewing. From childhood, Frances had learned this craft. Her slender, nimble fingers were accustomed to needle and thread, mending old dresses and embroidering patterns that sometimes felt like her only way to express hidden emotions. Her appearance was plain but captivating. Light hair tied back in a tight bun to keep it out of the way while working, gray-green eyes that held a thoughtful depth, and pale skin lightly touched by the sun from her walks along the shore. Frances's clothes were simple, gray or blue cotton dresses, their hems often dirtied by the dust of the streets, but her movements carried a grace she herself didn't notice, as if inherited from some distant ancestor. The Winters boarding house was small but cozy. 3 upstairs rooms for guests, a kitchen downstairs where a kettle always simmered, and a little sewing workshop at the back where Frances spent most of her time. She rose at dawn, helping her mother prepare breakfast for the lodgers, mostly elderly women who came to the coast for fresh air. Then came work, darning, hemming, sometimes urgent orders from neighbors. Frances loved those hours. The needle in her hand was like a writer's pen, the fabric a canvas where she could create something new from the old. But sometimes, in the quiet of the workshop, her thoughts drifted far away. She dreamed of travel, of cities where women wore vibrant dresses and lived freely, unburdened by neighbors' opinions. These dreams were her secret, as was the faint sadness that sometimes washed over her when she thought of her father, lost at sea when she was only 10. Mrs. Winters, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and fine lines around her eyes, was strict but loving. She often told Frances, "Life isn't a fairy tale, girl. You have to work to survive." The boarding house brought in a modest income, enough for food and repairs to the house, which creaked at night, as if complaining of its age. Among the lodgers was Mrs. Barclay, a middle-aged woman with a commanding voice and a habit of giving orders, who had lived there for a year and acted as if she owned the place. She often grumbled about street noise or the quality of the tea, but she paid on time, so Mrs. Winters tolerated her. On that overcast autumn day in the 1890s, when the sky frowned and the wind swept scraps of leaves through the streets, Frances sat in the sewing room by the window, mending an old curtain. Her needle moved swiftly, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was recalling a dream from the night before about a grand city where she was free. Suddenly, a knock came at the boarding house door. Mrs. Winters went to answer, and a moment later her voice echoed through the house. "Frances, come here. We have a new guest." Frances set her work aside and stepped into the corridor. In the doorway stood a woman whose elegance stood out sharply against the simplicity of the boarding house. It was Lydia Rayne, about 30 years old, with dark hair styled in an exquisite updo and a silk dress the color of ivory that flowed like a waterfall. Her brown eyes sparkled with confidence, and her smile was warm yet tinged with mystery. She held a small valise, and her shoulders were draped in a rain-soaked cloak. "Good day," she said softly, with a hint of authority. "I'm Lydia Rayne. I'm looking for a place to rest. I hope you have a room for me." Mrs. Winters nodded, hiding her surprise. This guest seemed too refined for their humble boarding house. "Of course, Miss Rayne. Frances will show you. We charge 5 shillings a week, with breakfast." Frances, feeling a slight flutter of excitement, nodded and led the guest up the stairs. The steps creaked under their feet, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and wood. "Here's your room," Frances said, opening the door to a small space with a view of the sea. Inside was a simple bed, a small table by the window, and a wardrobe. Nothing extravagant, but clean and cozy. Lydia stepped in, looked around, and her gaze lingered on Frances. "Thank you, dear. Do you work here?" "Yes, I help my mother," Frances replied, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything sewn or mended, I can do it." Lydia's smile widened. "Interesting. I love beautiful things. Perhaps you could show me your work later?" Frances nodded, unsure of what to say, and left the guest alone. But in the corridor she paused, her heart beating faster. Who was this woman? Why did her presence stir such feelings? That evening at dinner, Lydia became the center of attention. Mrs. Barclay, seated opposite, asked, "Where are you from, Miss Rayne? You look like a lady from a big city." Lydia leaned back in her chair, her silk dress rustling. "From London, but I travel. I'm seeking peace by the sea." "And you?" Barclay snorted. I'm here to escape the noise, but this boarding house is no palace. Lydia laughed. I like simplicity. It's honest. Frances sat quietly, observing. Lydia caught her eye, and each time Frances blushed after dinner as the others dispersed. Lydia approached. Frances, would you show me your sewing? Frances nodded, and they went to the sewing room. Frances spread out her work. Embroidered handkerchiefs, mended dresses. Lydia picked up one. This is lovely. You have talent. I'd like you to make something special for me. Frances whispered. I'll try. Their hands brushed, and Frances felt a warmth spread through her. From that day, their meetings became regular. Lydia brought fabrics and sketches. Frances sewed, and they talked. Tell me about yourself, Lydia would say. Frances, usually reserved, opened up. My father drowned at sea when I was little. Mother raised me alone. I love sewing, but sometimes I dream of more. Lydia nodded. Dreams are the start of change. I dreamed too, and here I am. Their conversations were warm, and Frances felt her world expanding. One evening by the fireplace, Lydia said, You're not like the others. There's a fire in you. Frances blushed. No one's ever said that to me. Lydia touched her cheek. Then I'll say it. The gesture left Frances confused, but joyful. Mrs. Winters noticed the change in her daughter, but said nothing, glad to see Frances come alive. Mrs. Barclay, however, frowned. That guest is with you too often. Be careful. Frances nodded, but in her heart, she knew Lydia was a light in her life. Their sewing became a ritual, each stitch infused with their growing closeness. Frances began to notice her hands trembling when Lydia was near, her gaze lingering on her lips. What does this mean? She wondered at night, listening to the sound of the sea. One evening, as rain drummed on the roof, Lydia asked Frances to stay. Let's talk about dreams, she said. Frances sat closer, their shoulders touching. Lydia whispered, I've seen the world, but I've never met anyone like you. Frances turned, their faces inches apart. Me too, she breathed. In that moment, their lips met, softly, like the rustle of fabric, full of trembling and discovery. Frances froze, but didn't pull away. When the kiss ended, she whispered, What was that? Lydia smiled, a beginning. But let's be careful. Frances returned to her room, her thoughts swirling. She didn't sleep that night, feeling the world shift. The next day they met again, and their sewing continued. But now every touch held a promise. Frances knew it was forbidden, but she couldn't stop. Lydia had become her heir. The autumn days in Whitstable grew gloomier. The sky over the town draped in gray clouds as if foreshadowing change. Life at the Winters boarding house carried on as usual, but with Lydia Rayne's arrival, a new atmosphere settled in, light as a sea breeze, yet brimming with mysteries that Frances Winters couldn't unravel. The 19-year-old daughter of a widow, accustomed to the steady rhythm of sewing and caring for her mother, began to notice her days taking on a new cadence. Her hands, so familiar with the needle, now trembled not just from fatigue, but from the anticipation of meetings with Lydia. This woman, with her elegant posture and warm voice, had become more than a guest of Frances. She was a figure around whom her thoughts spun, like thread around a bobbin. Lydia Rayne, a woman of about 30, possessed a rare ability to draw attention. Her dark hair, styled in an intricate updo, and her silk dresses, slightly creased from long travels, created an aura of refinement that stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of the boarding house. She quickly settled in, helping Mrs. Winters with chores or trading quips with Mrs. Barclay, the stern, sharp-voiced lodger who had lived there for a year. But most often, Lydia sought Frances's company. They spent hours sewing together. Lydia brought sketches of dresses with ruffles and soft folds, and Frances, with her nimble fingers, brought them to life. Those hours became a refuge for Frances from the dullness of routine, where her thoughts found solace in Lydia's quiet tales of distant cities and her own life, filled with wanderings and searching. One evening, as rain drummed on the roof, filling the room with a low hum, Lydia called Frances to her. I want to show you something, she said with a faint smile, inviting the girl to her room. Frances, still holding her needle, felt a flutter of excitement, but followed her up the creaking stairs. Lydia's room was cozy, a small bed with an embroidered coverlet, a table by the window cluttered with books and papers, and a faint scent of flowers lingering in the air. On the table lay neatly folded sketches depicting dresses with intricate details, wide sleeves, deep necklines, and delicate drapery. Look, Lydia said, handing her a sheet. I think you could make something like this. You have a gift. Frances took the sketch, her fingers trembling slightly. These designs were unlike her usual work, simple mending and embroidery for her mother. I'm not sure I can do it, she whispered, glancing up at Lydia. The woman gently touched her hand, a warmth passing through the brief contact. "Try," she replied, her voice full of encouragement. "I believe in you." That gesture awakened something new in Frances, a mix of exhilaration and shyness she couldn't explain. She nodded, promising herself to try, though deep down she knew it wasn't just about sewing. From that evening, their shared work became a ritual. Each morning, after Mrs. Winters left for errands and Mrs. Barclay buried herself in her newspapers, Frances would go to Lydia. They sat by the window, where light filtered through raindrops, and worked on fabrics. Frances embroidered patterns while Lydia offered advice, her voice like a melody weaving through the crackle of the fireplace. Sometimes they laughed over clumsy stitches, sometimes they fell silent, lost in their thoughts. Frances noticed her movements growing more confident under Lydia's gaze, and Lydia, in turn, seemed pleased with every success the girl achieved. Those hours became a sanctuary for Frances, where she could forget her mother's strict rules and the grayness of daily life. One day, as the rain intensified, turning the street into a mirror of puddles, Lydia suggested staying longer. "Let's sit by the fire," she said, gesturing to the warm corner of the room. Frances agreed, and they settled on a rug before the hearth, surrounded by soft light and the scent of burning wood. Lydia pulled out a book of poetry and began reading aloud, lines about nature and emotions that sounded like the whisper of the wind. Frances listened, her heart beating in time with the words. "Do you like such lines?" Lydia asked, closing the book. "Yes," Frances replied, her voice trembling. "They remind me of things I don't yet know." Lydia looked at her with interest. "Tell me about yourself," she urged, leaning closer. Frances lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "My life is the boarding house and sewing. Mother always wanted me to stay here, but sometimes I dream of leaving, of seeing the world." Lydia nodded, her eyes darkening. "I dreamed too. My family wanted me to live by their rules, but I ran away. The world is harsh to those who choose their own path." Frances felt an echo of her own thoughts. "And what are you searching for now?" she asked. "Peace," Lydia replied, "and perhaps someone who understands me." Silence hung between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Frances felt her heart open, like a flower under the sun. She didn't know how to express it, but in Lydia's eyes she saw a reflection of her own feelings. In that moment, Lydia reached out and gently squeezed Frances's fingers. "You're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Frances froze, feeling the warmth of that closeness. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "I don't understand what this is," she exhaled, her voice trembling with confusion. Lydia smiled, her gaze full of tenderness. "It's the start of something new. Let's not rush." They let go of each other's hands, but the air between them had changed, charged, almost tangible. Frances returned to her room late, her thoughts swirling around Lydia. She lay down, listening to the sound of the rain, and for the first time in a long while, felt that her life could change. The next day, they met again by the fire, and their work continued, but now every stitch, every glance held something more, a quiet promise they weren't yet ready to name. A week passed, and their meetings became regular. Frances began to notice how her hands trembled when Lydia was too close, how her heart skipped when Lydia smiled. One day, while working on an intricate sleeve, Lydia said, "You're beautiful when you're focused." Frances blushed, lowering her eyes. "No one's ever said that," she whispered. Lydia leaned closer, her breath brushing the girl's cheek. "Then I'll say it more often." That moment lingered in Frances's memory as the first hint of something special growing between them. Evenings by the fireplace became their little world. They discussed books, dreams, even their fears. Lydia spoke of a childhood in a strict household, stifled by family expectations, while Frances shared her secret longing to sail across the sea. "Maybe one day we'll go together," Lydia teased, but her voice carried a note of hope. Frances smiled, unsure how to respond, but a spark ignited in her heart. They began exchanging notes, short but brimming with warmth. "You're my light in this house," Lydia wrote once. Frances tucked the note under her pillow, feeling her world expand. Their closeness didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Barclay, with her sharp gaze, began to suspect something. "Frances, you spend too much time with that woman," she said one evening at dinner, her tone laced with disapproval. Frances faltered, but Lydia, seated beside her, replied, "We're just working on sewing, nothing improper." Mrs. Barclay snorted but said no more. Frances felt a pang of unease, but beside Lydia she found the strength to brush it off. One night, when the rain had quieted, Lydia invited Frances for a walk along the shore. The sea breeze was cool, but their steps fell in sync, as if they walked the same path. "Have you ever thought about love?" Lydia asked, her voice barely audible over the waves. Frances hesitated. "I don't know what it is," she admitted. Lydia stopped, turning to face her. "It's when someone sees the real you," she said, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. Frances felt her heart tighten. She stepped closer, and their hands brushed again. "Do you see me?" she whispered. "Yes," Lydia replied, and in that moment, something intangible but powerful hung between them. They returned to the boarding house near dawn, their silence filled with new meaning. Frances lay down but couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were consumed by Lydia, her words, her touch. The next day, they sat down to sew again, but now every stitch was infused with their secret. Lydia whispered advice, Frances responded with smiles, and their bond grew like a flower pushing through cracks in stone. This world, hidden from prying eyes, became their sanctuary, where they could be themselves despite the reality around them. Another week passed, and their relationship deepened. Frances noticed how her heart responded to every glance from Lydia, how her breath quickened when she drew near. One day, while working on a dress with a long hem, Lydia said, "You amaze me with your strength." Frances smiled, feeling warmth. "You make me believe in myself," she replied. Lydia leaned in, their shoulders touching, and in that moment, Frances knew her life would never be the same. Evenings by the fire became their ritual. They read poetry, shared dreams of a future free from rigid rules. Lydia spoke of her youth, how she left home for freedom, and Frances confessed her fear of disappointing her mother. "You have to find your own path," Lydia said, her voice full of support. Frances nodded, feeling her soul awaken. Their notes grew longer, more heartfelt. "You're my quiet haven," Frances wrote once. Lydia tucked the note into a book, smiling, but a shadow loomed over their happiness. Mrs. Barclay grew more persistent, her remarks sharper. "That woman is influencing you, Frances," she said one day. Frances defended Lydia, but her unease grew. One night Lydia whispered, "We must be careful." Frances nodded, but in her heart, a fire burned that she couldn't extinguish. The autumn chill enveloped Whitstable, and the salty sea wind grew sharper, seeping through the cracks of the old winter's boarding house. Days filled with sewing and quiet conversations left an indelible mark on Frances Winters's soul, one she could no longer ignore. Her 19-year-old life, once confined to the walls of the house and the care of her mother, was now colored by the presence of Lydia Rayne, a woman whose refinement and warm gaze awakened feelings Frances had never dared to entertain. Their bond, which began with sewing and walks along the shore, deepened, like the sea they both loved to watch. Lydia, with her dark hair gathered in an elegant updo and silk dresses that flowed softly with every movement, remained an enigma to everyone in the boarding house. Her help with Mrs. Winters's chores and light banter with Mrs. Barclay masked the true focus of her attention, Frances. Their morning meetings by the window, where light danced on fabrics, and evenings by the fireplace, filled with poetry and whispered dreams, became more than a ritual for Frances. They were a refuge where she could be herself. The notes they exchanged, full of warmth and hope, became symbols of their growing closeness. A week had passed since Lydia whispered to Frances about the need for caution. The unease caused by Mrs. Barclay's suspicions grew, but it only strengthened Frances's desire to be closer to Lydia. One evening, as rain drummed on the roof again, Lydia called Frances to her room. "Let's take shelter from the storm," she said with a soft smile, opening her door. Frances, feeling a flutter of excitement, entered, clutching a needle she'd forgotten to set down. Lydia's room was warm, lit by the faint glow of a candle on the table. The bed with its embroidered coverlet, scattered books by the window, and the faint scent of flowers created an atmosphere of coziness. Lydia closed the door and turned to Frances. "Tonight, I just want us to be together," she said quietly, her voice trembling with something new. Frances nodded, her heart racing. They sat on the bed, closer than usual, and Lydia took her hand, not letting go of her fingers. "Are you afraid?" Lydia asked, her brown eyes searching for an answer in Frances's gray-green ones. "Yes," Frances whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't want to leave." Lydia smiled, her fingers gently squeezing the girl's hand. "Then let's stay here, just us." Silence hung between them, broken only by the sound of rain and the flicker of the candle. Frances felt her breath grow uneven as Lydia leaned closer. Their faces were inches apart, and the warmth of Lydia's breath brushed her skin. "May I?" Lydia whispered, her voice full of tenderness. Frances nodded, unable to look away. Their lips met, tentatively, at first, like the cascade of silk, then deeper, with a trembling that echoed all their unspoken feelings. Frances froze, her hands shaking, but she didn't pull away. Lydia's arms gently enveloped her, drawing her closer, and the gesture unleashed a wave of warmth in Frances that she couldn't control. Her fingers brushed Lydia's waist, feeling the fabric of her dress under her palms, and her heart swelled with something new, almost sacred. They parted for a moment, their foreheads touching, and Frances whispered, "I've never felt this before." Lydia smiled, her fingers grazing the girl's cheek. "Neither have I," she replied, "but it's real." Their kiss resumed, now with greater certainty. Frances felt her body respond to Lydia's touch. Her hands slid along her back, then rested gently on her shoulders. Lydia guided her back softly, and they sank onto the bed, their closeness unbroken. In that moment, the world outside vanished. The rain became a backdrop to their breathing, and the candlelight cast shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of seclusion. Frances's hands, accustomed to the needle, now explored the softness of Lydia's silk dress, trembling with excitement. Lydia, in turn, ran her fingers through Frances's hair, loosening her bun, and light strands spilled over her shoulders. "You're beautiful," she whispered, her lips brushing Frances's neck, sending a shiver through her. Frances closed her eyes, letting herself dissolve in the moment. Her arms tentatively embraced Lydia, and they pressed closer, feeling the warmth of each other's bodies through the fabric. Their kisses deepened, and Frances felt her heart beat in unison with Lydia's. They lay entwined, and time seemed to stop. Lydia whispered words of comfort, her voice like a caress. "We're safe here, just you and me." An hour passed, perhaps more. Frances lost track of time. They lay side by side, her head resting on Lydia's shoulder, their hands intertwined. The rain had quieted, leaving a silence broken only by their breathing. Frances felt exposed, not just physically but emotionally, and it was strange but beautiful. "What now?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and happiness. Lydia turned to her, her gaze full of tenderness. "Now we protect this," she said, her fingers gently stroking Frances's hair. "But we must be careful. The world beyond these walls isn't ready to understand us." Frances nodded, her heart tightening with the truth of it. She knew their closeness was fragile, something to be guarded. They dressed in silence, exchanging glances full of promises. Lydia helped Frances fix her hair, pinning it back with a gentle smile. "You're my secret," she whispered, and Frances returned a faint smile, feeling her soul fill with light. They left the room, but every step was infused with a new awareness of their bond. The next day, their sewing continued, but now every movement carried the memory of the previous night. Frances caught Lydia's gaze, and her heart fluttered. Mrs. Barclay, as always, watched, her suspicions growing more apparent. "You're with her too often," she said at breakfast, her tone sharp. Frances pressed her lips together, but Lydia interjected, "We're just working, nothing more." Yet inside, Frances's unease grew. Their secret was at risk of being exposed. That evening, Lydia left a note. "Meet me by the sea when everyone's asleep." Frances waited until the house fell silent and slipped out to the shore. Lydia was already there, her silhouette standing out against the moonlight. They embraced, and Frances whispered, "I'm afraid of losing you." Lydia held her closer. "We'll find a way," she replied, and their lips met again under the stars, promising the continuation of their story. Another week passed, and their meetings grew more secretive. They found moments of solitude, in the sewing room after dinner, on walks under the cover of night. Every touch, every kiss strengthened their bond, but also heightened their fear. Mrs. Barclay began questioning Mrs. Winters, and tension in the house mounted. Frances knew their closeness was a risk, but she couldn't turn away from Lydia, who had become her world. One night, as a storm raged with renewed fury, Lydia called Frances again. "Let's take shelter together," she said, and Frances followed without hesitation. Their intimacy deepened, more profound, more tender. They lay entwined, listening to the storm, and Frances felt their love was a force that could withstand anything. But beyond the room, the shadow of suspicion grew darker. Mrs. Barclay overheard their footsteps, and the next morning, her gaze was full of judgment. Frances realized their secret was on the verge of unraveling, and her heart clenched with fear. Lydia, noticing her distress, whispered, "We must be prepared. Their story was only beginning, with trials ahead they couldn't yet foresee." The autumn chill deepened in Whitstable, where the sea wind grew sharper and the days shorter, like the shadows of doubt looming over the Winters boarding house. Frances Winters, the 19-year-old daughter of a widow, felt her world, recently filled with warmth and secret meetings with Lydia Rayne, beginning to crumble under the weight of reality. Their bond, born of sewing and walks along the shore, was now steeped in fear. Fear of exposure, fear of loss. Frances, with her light hair tied in a bun and gray-green eyes full of worry, spent her days in the sewing room, where every stitch reminded her of Lydia. But at night, dreams of being together, free from judgment, haunted her. Lydia Rayne, a woman in her 30s with dark hair and determined brown eyes, also sensed the approaching storm. Her silk dresses, once symbols of freedom, now felt like a burden in this small house where walls had ears. She continued helping Mrs. Winters, but her thoughts were tethered to Frances. Their notes, short and tender, were their salvation. "You are my refuge in the storm," Lydia wrote. Frances kept them under her mattress, rereading them at night when the boarding house grew quiet. But secrets couldn't stay hidden forever. Mrs. Winters, a woman with graying hair and weary eyes, was always attentive to her daughter. One day, while tidying Frances's room, she noticed a slip of paper fall from under the pillow. Picking it up, she read words written in Lydia's neat handwriting. "My thoughts are always with you. Let's find a way to be together forever." Mrs. Winters's heart sank. She recalled her suspicions, which she had dismissed as mere friendship, but now everything fell into place. The frequent meetings, the warm glances, and Frances's strange detachment. That evening, as rain tapped on the roof, Mrs. Winters called her daughter to the kitchen. Frances entered, unsuspecting, her hands still threaded with sewing. "Mother, is something wrong?" she asked, seeing her mother's serious expression. Mrs. Winters placed the note on the table. "What is this? You and that woman, Lydia?" Frances froze, her face paling. "Mother, it's not what you think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're just friends." Mrs. Winters shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't lie to me, Frances. I've seen how you've changed. This connection, it's unnatural. This town won't forgive such things. I won't let you ruin your life." Frances stepped closer, her hands clenching into fists. "Mother, please, don't say that. Lydia, she understands me like no one else. I love her." The words burst out, and Frances broke into tears, her cheeks wet. Mrs. Winters stood, her voice firm. "Love? It's a sin, girl. I asked Mrs. Barclay to keep an eye out, and she confirmed my suspicions. Lydia must leave. Tomorrow." Frances fell to her knees, tears dripping onto the floor. "No, Mother. Please don't do this. If she leaves, I'll go with her. I can't live without her." Her voice broke, pain tearing at her chest. "You don't understand how much it hurts to hide who I am." Mrs. Winters turned away, her shoulders trembling. "I'm doing this for you, Frances, to save you from shame. Go to your room. I'll speak to Lydia." Frances rose, her eyes burning with desperation. "You'll ruin my life," she cried, running out, tears blinding her. In her room, Lydia heard the commotion and came downstairs. Mrs. Winters, holding the note, said, "Miss Rayne, you must leave. Your influence on my daughter. It's unacceptable." Lydia paled but kept her voice steady. "I love Frances. We're not hurting anyone." Mrs. Winters shook her head. "Leave tomorrow, or I'll call the authorities." Lydia nodded, her heart breaking, but she said, "Fine. But let me say goodbye." Frances locked herself in her room, sobbing into her pillow. Lydia knocked softly. "Frances, it's me," she whispered. The girl opened the door, her eyes red from crying. "She wants you to leave," Frances sobbed, falling into Lydia's arms. "I won't let her. I'll go with you." Lydia held her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "We have to. But this isn't the end. I'll find a way. We'll be together. I promise." They kissed through their tears, their lips trembling with pain. "I love you," Frances whispered. "And I love you," Lydia replied. "We're determined. We'll leave together." But Mrs. Winters overheard and intervened. "No, Frances, you're staying." She pulled her daughter away, locking the door. Frances screamed, pounding on it. "Mother, please, it's my life." Tears streamed down her face, her soul torn apart. "I can't live without her." She sobbed, collapsing to the floor. Lydia, standing outside the door, heard everything. Her heart ached, but she couldn't leave without hope. She wrote a note, "My love. Write to me at London, 42 Marylebone Street. We'll find a way to be together. Your Lydia." She slipped it under the door, and Frances, seeing it, grabbed it, clutching it to her chest. Tears fell onto the paper, but a spark of hope ignited in her soul. They would write, and that would be their thread across the distance. The next day, Lydia left, her valise light but her heart heavy. Frances stood at the window, tears streaming down her cheeks, watching the carriage take her love away. Mrs. Winters, holding her daughter, whispered, "It's for your own good." But Frances knew her heart was broken, and only letters could mend it. A month had passed since Lydia Rayne left Whitstable, leaving Frances Winters trapped in a prison of pain and loneliness. The autumn days had given way to the damp chill of November, and the town seemed cloaked in a gray veil that mirrored Frances's state of mind. The 19-year-old daughter of Mrs. Winters, once full of life and inspiration, was now a shadow of herself. Her light hair, still tied in a tight bun, looked dull, and her gray-green eyes, once bright with dreams, were clouded with sorrow. She had grown thinner. Her lack of appetite had sharpened her features, and her movements were slow, stripped of their former grace. Even sewing, once her solace and joy, lay untouched in the sewing room, where the needle rusted and the fabric gathered dust. Mrs. Winters, with her weary eyes and graying hair, watched her daughter with growing concern. She tried to pull Frances back to life, urging her to eat and help around the house, but each morning she saw the same scene, her daughter, pale and silent, emerging from her room with a vacant stare. Mrs. Barclay, whose suspicions had led to Lydia's departure, occasionally made cutting remarks, but even her voice felt like distant noise. Frances didn't respond. Her thoughts were consumed by Lydia, the woman who had left with only a note bearing an address, London, 42 Marylebone Street. On that first day after Lydia's departure, despite her tears and the locked door, Frances wrote a letter. Her hand trembled as she penned the words, "My dearest Lydia, I can't live without you. Mother locked me in, but I'll find a way. Please write to me. Your Frances." She sent it through a neighbor's boy who agreed to slip it into the mailbox, risking Mrs. Winters' wrath. But days passed with no reply. Each morning, Frances, clutching a handkerchief, stood at the crossroads by the boarding house where the postman passed with his bag of letters. She waited, hoping to see an envelope with a London postmark, but returned empty-handed, her heart growing heavier. Mrs. Winters tried to stop these morning vigils. "Frances, it's pointless," she said, but her daughter only shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I have to know." Her mother sighed, realizing the fight against this longing was futile, and let her continue, hoping time would heal the wound. But time only deepened it. Frances grew thinner, her hands trembled, and her nights were filled with nightmares of Lydia vanishing into a crowd. Exactly 1 month had passed, December 16th, 1890, since the carriage took Lydia away. The morning was cold, with thick fog blanketing Whitstable streets, obscuring the outlines of houses. Frances, as always, threw on an old coat and went to the crossroads, her breath turning to mist in the frosty air. She stood, arms wrapped around herself, staring down the road where the postman would appear. Her feet were numb, her heart heavy with familiar disappointment, but she didn't leave. It was her only hope. Then, through the gray haze, she saw a figure. The postman, a young man named Thomas, running toward her, his boots squelching in the damp earth. He held something white, and his face glowed with a rare smile. "Miss Winters," he called, breathless from running. Frances froze, her heart pounding. He handed her a letter, and she saw the familiar handwriting, Lydia's neat script. The London postmark was blurred from dampness, but it was there. "Finally," Thomas said, his voice full of joy. "I've been waiting for this day to cheer you up." Frances took the letter with trembling hands, her eyes welling with tears. She whispered, "Thank you," and clutched the envelope to her chest, feeling the warmth of hope return to her soul. Thomas nodded and left, leaving her alone at the crossroads. She didn't open the letter right away, afraid it might be an illusion, but walked slowly back to the boarding house, holding it like a precious treasure. Her steps were lighter than they'd been in a month, and for the first time in ages a faint smile touched her lips. Back in her room, Frances locked the door and sat on the bed. Her fingers shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet written in Lydia's hand, carrying the faint scent of silk she loved. Frances began to read, tears streaming down her cheeks. But now they were tears of relief. "My dearest Frances, forgive me for making you wait. I reached London, but the first weeks were chaos. I was searching for work, a place to live, a way to reach you. Your letter reached me only yesterday, and I wept reading it. My love, I haven't forgotten you. Your mother is right about one thing. The world is cruel, but we are stronger. I've found a place where I can work as a seamstress, and now I have an address. Write to me, and we'll find a way to be together. Your Lydia." Frances pressed the letter to her chest, her heart racing. The hope she had nearly lost was back. She knew challenges lay ahead. Mrs. Winters wouldn't relent, and Mrs. Barclay would keep watching. But now she had an address, a thread connecting her to Lydia. She took a pen and began to write a reply, her hand trembling but her words flowing freely. "My love, I waited for you. We'll find a way. Your Frances." Outside, the fog began to lift, and the first ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating her face. She knew this was only the beginning, and their story would face more trials, but with the letter in her hands, she felt her strength returning. Frances fell asleep with the letter in her hands, her face, usually pale and weary, now glowing with calm. The envelope lay on her pillow, and she clutched it like a precious treasure. Sleep came to her for the first time in a month, peaceful, free of nightmares filled with images of Lydia, her smile, and her warmth. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtain, Frances's door creaked softly. Mrs. Winters entered, her steps cautious but her eyes resolute. She saw her daughter sleeping with the letter in her hands, and her heart tightened with a mix of love and anger. Stepping closer, she noticed the London postmark in the familiar handwriting. "It's her," Mrs. Winters whispered, her lips pressing into a thin line. She carefully plucked the letter from Frances's sleeping grasp, taking care not to wake her. Frances stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. Mrs. Winters unfolded the letter and read the words brimming with love and hope. Her face twisted with indignation. "You must forget this woman," she muttered, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't for you, Frances. It will only bring shame." Tears welled in her eyes, but she clenched her jaw and tore the letter into tiny pieces. The scraps fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves carried by the wind. The rustle woke Frances, her eyes snapping open. Seeing her mother with the torn pieces in her hands, she sat up, her face draining of color. "Mother, no! What have you done?" she cried, scrambling to the floor to gather the fragments. Tears streamed from her eyes as she crawled, collecting the scraps, her hands shaking. It was from Lydia. The address was there. How will I find her now? Mrs. Winters stood with her arms crossed, her eyes filled with pain. "It's for your own good, Frances. That woman is trouble. You must forget her and live a normal life. I won't let you ruin yourself." Frances sobbed, her tears smudging the ink on the paper. "You've ruined my life. I love her, Mother. How could you?" She clutched the scraps to her chest, her body racked with sobs. Mrs. Winters stepped forward, trying to embrace her daughter, but Frances pulled away. "Leave me alone. You don't understand." Her mother left, her shoulders slumped, but her resolve unshaken. Frances remained alone, gathering the pieces, desperately trying to piece them together to salvage the address. Tears fell, her chest ached with pain, but hope lingered in her heart. She would find Lydia, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in London at 42 Marylebone Street, Lydia Rayne was starting a new life. She had found work as a seamstress in a small workshop, where her talent quickly stood out. Her rented room was modest, a bed, a table, and a window overlooking a bustling street, but she was filled with strength and determination. Each morning she rose at dawn, sewing dresses to save money. Her thoughts were with Frances. She imagined bringing her to London, where they could be together, free from the judgment of a small town. "I'll build us a home," she thought, working on a dress Frances might wear. Her plan was simple, work save, and when the time came, return for her beloved. She wrote letters, her first one sent a month ago full of hope. Lydia didn't know it had reached Frances and was awaiting a reply, her heart beating with anticipation. At the workshop, Lydia quickly earned respect. Her deft fingers crafted masterpieces, and the owner, Mrs. Gray, often praised her. "You're a talent, Lydia. You'll have your own shop. Soon." But Lydia smiled, her thoughts elsewhere. She decorated her room, adding curtains, a sewing table, and even a book of poetry to read in the evenings, imagining sharing it with Frances. "We'll be together," she whispered, falling asleep. Her days were filled with work, but her nights were alive with dreams of their reunion. In Whitstable, Frances hid the scraps under her mattress. The pain was unbearable, but she knew the address was the key to their future. She would wait, and when the time came, she would find a way to reach Lydia. That night, by the dim light of a candle, Frances took pen and paper. Her hand, trembling from exhaustion and emotion, began to write words filled with hope and strength. "My dearest Lydia, your letter, even torn, gave me life. Mother thinks she can break me, but I won't give up. I'll fight for our love. I'll take up sewing again. More orders, more work. I'll save money and come to you in London. We'll be together, as you promised. Wait for me. Your Frances." She folded the letter, sealed it, and hid it under her mattress to send through Thomas, the postman she trusted, in the morning. For the first time in a month, Frances felt purpose. Her gray-green eyes, dulled by sorrow, sparkled again, and a faint but genuine smile lit her thin face. Sewing, which she had abandoned, now became her weapon, a path to freedom and to Lydia. The next morning, September 18th, 1890, Frances woke at dawn, as she had in the days when her life brimmed with inspiration. She helped her mother prepare breakfast for the lodgers, including the grumbling Mrs. Barclay, whose sharp remarks now slid past her. Mrs. Winters noticed the change in her daughter. Her movements were steadier, her gaze more focused. "You look better," she said cautiously, but Frances only nodded, unwilling to reveal her plans. After morning chores, Frances sought out Thomas, handing him the letter with a request to send it to London. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. He smiled. "Happy to help, Miss Winters. Hope you get a reply soon." Returning home, she went to the sewing room, which had gathered dust over the month. She opened the chest of fabrics, took up a needle, and began working on a simple handkerchief, her fingers regaining their old dexterity. That day, Frances decided to take on orders. She visited neighbors, fishermen, traders, even families on the outskirts, offering to mend clothes or sew something new. 2 shillings for a dress, 3 for a hem, she said, her voice growing confident. By evening she had 3 orders and earned her first penny, which she dropped triumphantly into an old tin piggy bank found in the attic. "It's a start," she whispered, gazing at the gleaming coin. From that day, her life found a rhythm. Each morning, Frances rose with the first light, helping her mother with the boarding house, brewing tea, cleaning rooms, enduring Mrs. Barclay's complaints. But by day, she worked on orders, darning torn sleeves, hemming skirts, embroidering patterns on handkerchiefs. Evenings and nights were devoted to sewing. Until midnight, she sat by lamplight, her needle flashing swiftly, fatigue yielding to thoughts of reuniting with Lydia. Every penny earned went into the piggy bank, which grew heavier. "For London," she repeated to herself, imagining embracing Lydia on the bustling streets of the city. Mrs. Winters noticed the change but didn't grasp its cause. "You're sewing again," she said one day, her tone cautious. "Yes, Mother, it helps," Frances replied, hiding the truth. Her mother nodded, hoping her daughter had forgotten Lydia, but Frances looked at the hidden address each evening and prayed for a reply. A week passed, and orders multiplied. Neighbors praised her work, and word of the talented seamstress spread through Whitstable. Frances sewed dresses, jackets, even children's clothes, her hands tireless. The piggy bank filled. 5 shillings, 10, 15. She calculated, enough for a ticket in a few months if I keep this up. Her cheeks regained color, her appetite returned, and she began to gain weight, though her heart still ached from the separation. One evening, while sewing a hem, Frances heard a knock at the door. It was Thomas, holding a letter. "From London, Miss Winters," he said with a smile. Frances snatched the envelope, her eyes shining. She ran to her room, locked the door, and opened the letter. "Lydia's handwriting was full of warmth, my love. Your letter gave me strength. I'm waiting for you. I'm working, building a life. Come when you can. You're Lydia." Frances wept with joy, clutching the letter to her chest. Now she had a goal, and she knew the struggle was just beginning. Each day she sewed, saved, and waited. The Winters boarding house came alive with her energy, but her mother still suspected something. Frances hid the piggy bank in letters, knowing that one day she would leave this house for love. Her heart beat in time with her dream of London, where she would meet Lydia and start a new life.